I saw the island from the cliff road on my fourth day in the country. I had pulled the rental car onto a gravel shoulder to let my legs stop shaking. The roads there clung to the coast like something afraid of falling, and I had driven most of the morning with my knuckles white and my jaw aching. When I stepped out into the wind, I was only looking for somewhere to breathe. Then I looked down at the water, and I forgot about the road entirely. The island sat maybe 2 miles offshore. It was small, a knuckle of dark rock with a green crown of low trees, and the sea around it was the color of old slate. No lighthouse, no jetty that I could see, no little white houses, the way the mainland villages had little white houses stacked up their hillsides like teeth. It was just there, separate, quiet, refusing the rest of the coastline. I stood at the railing and felt something in my chest lean toward it. I had come abroad to get away from people, which is a thing I had been trying to do for most of my adult life. I never learned to want what other people wanted: crowds, careers, the endless small machinery of belonging to a society, the obligations that come dressed up as friendships, the noise of other lives pressing against mine from every side. All of it sat on me like a weight I had never agreed to carry. I had spent years shedding it piece by piece. I let the job go, then the flat, then the handful of people who had ever expected anything of me. And when there was nothing left to shed, I bought a ticket to a country where no one knew my name and went looking for somewhere the world could not reach me. The island looked like the most alone a person could possibly be. That was the whole of its appeal. Everything that came after grew out of that one stupid, simple want. I asked about it in the village that evening. The man who ran the guest house was old and broad and missing 2 fingers on his left hand. His English was thin, but workable. I described the island, pointed roughly south along the coast, and watched his face change. He set down the glass he had been drying. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said a word in his own language that I did not know, and shook his head, and turned away to the shelves behind the bar. I pressed him. I am ashamed of that now. I told him I only wanted to camp there a night, maybe 2, that I had a tent and supplies, and that I knew the sea. He did not turn around. He said, in his careful, broken way, that no one went there, that the fishermen did not go there. The water around it took boats and did not give them back, and that his grandfather had known the names of 3 men who tried it, and a 4th who came back without his eyes. He essentially told me to stay the fuck away from there. I thought he was selling me a story. People in beautiful places often have a story like that, a local legend they trot out for the tourists, and I had heard versions of it in 3 other countries. I smiled at him and thanked him and went up to my room. I couldn't sleep, because all night I could feel the island out there in the dark, separate, waiting, and I had already decided I was going to go. The boat I found was a small open sailing dinghy, 14 feet, single mast, in the keeping of a younger man 2 coves north, who did not share the old man's superstitions and was happy to take my money for 3 days' rental. I did not tell him where I was going. I told him I wanted to explore the near coast. He nodded and counted the notes, and told me to mind the afternoon wind. I had sailed since I was a boy. I was not a fool on the water, and that mattered later. I checked the hull and the lines and the little outboard that hung off the stern for when the wind died. I loaded my tent and my sleeping bag, 2 jugs of fresh water, a camp stove, food for 4 days, a first aid kit, a knife, a hatchet for firewood, a torch, and a phone that I knew would lose signal somewhere out past the headland. I told myself this was an adventure. The truth is closer to the fact that nothing in the world was tethered to me any longer, and a man with nothing tethered to him does not guard his own life with much care, which is a dangerous thing to leave in charge of a small boat. The crossing took 3 hours. The wind was kind for the first 2. Then, about a mile out, it died all at once, the way a held breath dies, and the sea went flat and oily and strange. I dropped the sail and started the outboard. The little engine coughed and caught, and I motored the last stretch through water so still I could see my own pale face looking back up at me. And below my face, far below, shapes that I told myself were rocks and weed and the tricks that deep water plays on a tired man's eyes. The island had one place to land, a shingle beach, maybe 40 feet wide, tucked into a fold of black rock. I ran the dinghy up onto the stones and dragged her clear of the tide line and tied her bowline to a boulder the size of a car. I remember being pleased with the knot. I remember standing on that beach in the long gold light of early evening, looking up at the green crown of trees, feeling more peace than I had felt in years. The island was beautiful. There is no use pretending it wasn't. There was a path of sorts up from the beach, worn into the rock, and it climbed through a gully and then opened out onto a high meadow of wind-flattened grass with the trees beyond. The view from the top was the whole curve of the mainland coast, the white villages tiny and golden, the lights just beginning to come on as the sun went down. I set my tent at the edge of the meadow where the grass met the trees, with my back to the woods and my face to the sea. I should have noticed the silence. There were no birds. An island like that, in that sea, should have been loud with gulls and terns, the whole crown of it white with droppings and noise. There was nothing. The trees behind me did not move, even when the wind came up off the water. But I had spent years hungry for exactly that kind of quiet, and so the silence felt like a gift, and I did not question a gift. I slept like a baby that first night, with the stars overhead and the sound of light waves grabbing the shore. It was the morning that pulled me out of that peace. I came down to the beach to wash and to check the dinghy, and the dinghy was gone. No, not gone. That would have been simpler. The dinghy was there, but she was wrong. Someone had pulled her further up the shingle, past where I had left her, and turned her over, and the bottom of her hull had been opened up. Not smashed, not stove in on a rock. Opened deliberately with something. The planks were not broken inward the way an impact breaks them. They were curled outward and apart, splintered along their length, as if something had pushed up through the wood from inside and peeled the boat like a fruit. The outboard was 20 feet away in the shallows, and its casing had been torn off, and the metal underneath was bent into shapes that I could not make my hands understand when I touched them. My bowline was still tied to the boulder. The knot I had been so proud of was exactly as I had left it. Whatever had done this had not needed to untie my boat. It had simply walked up the beach in the night, while I slept 40 feet from the trees, and it had taken my one-way home apart with its hands. I stood there in the wet shingle for a long time, The cold that went through me was not like any cold I have a name for. It was not fear, not yet. It was the dawning understanding that the silence had not been a gift, that the man in the guest house had not been selling me a story, that I was alone, 2 miles from the nearest human being, on a piece of rock in a flat dead sea, with a boat that could not float, and a phone that had no signal and a tent pitched with its back to the woods. I just might be fucked. I checked the phone. Nothing. I climbed back up to the high meadow and held it over my head and walked the whole crown of the island, and there was nothing, not one bar, not anywhere. I shouted across the water at the mainland, which is a thing a panicking animal does, and my voice went out flat and small, and the sea swallowed it and gave nothing back. And the whole time I walked and shouted, I had the feeling of being watched. I caught it first at the treeline, a movement at the edge of my eye, low and quick, the way a dog moves when it does not want to be seen moving. I turned, and there was nothing, only the dark between the trunks, the woods standing as still as they had stood all night. I told myself it was a deer. I told myself there must be animals on the island, that of course there were animals, that I had simply not seen the birds because the birds were somewhere else. I did not believe a word of it. The thing at the tree line had not moved like a deer. It had moved like something watching a man to learn him. I spent that day trying to fix the boat, because a man needs something to do with his hands, or the fear gets into the rest of him. It was hopeless. The hull was beyond me. I had no way to make those curled and splintered planks hold water. But I worked at it anyway, through the long, bright afternoon, and twice more I saw the movement at the edge of the trees. And once I heard a sound from the woods that I have never been able to name. It was low, and it was wet, and it had a rhythm to it like breathing, but slower than any breathing should be, and it stopped the instant I went still to listen. That second night I did not pitch the tent. I built a fire on the beach, big as I could feed it, and I sat with my back to the boulder and my hatchet across my knees, and I watched the line where the firelight ended and the dark began. The thing in the woods did not come down to the beach, but all night I heard it moving up at the tree line, back and forth, patient, and every so often it made that slow, wet sound, and once, just once, in the dead black middle of the night, I am almost certain it laughed. I found the first body on the third day. I had decided that if I could not fix the boat and could not call for help, then I had to understand the island. I had to know what was on it with me. So I took the hatchet and the knife, and I went into the woods, which is the bravest and stupidest thing I have ever done, and the woods are where the bodies were. They were arranged. It was pretty fucking upsetting. The first one I found was sitting against the base of a tree, what was left of it, and had been there a long time. Fully decomposed, down to a skeleton, picked clean by something. The clothes were rotted to rags, but I could see they had been a fisherman's clothes, oilskins, and heavy boots. The body inside them was mostly bone and leather, but it was sitting up, deliberately, propped against the trunk with its hands folded in its lap, and its skull had been turned to face the path so that whoever came up that path would find it looking at them. Someone had posed it, someone had wanted it to be found exactly this way. The second body was 20 yards on, and it was less decayed, months, not years. It hung from a low branch by a loop of its own intestine, which had been drawn out and looped over the branch, with the care of a man hanging his washing. The face was gone, simply gone, scraped down to the wet red architecture of the skull, and I understood then what the guest house keeper had meant about the man who came back without his eyes. I counted 9 bodies in those woods before I stopped counting, before my mind simply refused to keep adding to the total. Some were old, sun-bleached, claimed by years. Some were terribly fresh. They were posed, all of them, arranged in the small clearings and against the trunks like an exhibition, like a collection a man might keep and tend and be proud of. And in the heart of the woods, in the largest clearing, I found the place where the thing that kept them lived. It was a hollow, a depression in the rock roofed over with a tangle of branches and turf and the long bones of the things it had eaten, and the smell that came out of it stopped me 10 feet short and bent me over to be sick in the bracken. And while I was bent over, retching, helpless, with my hands on my knees, I heard the slow, wet breathing start up directly behind me. Close, very close. Close enough that I felt the heat of it on the back of my neck. I did not turn around. I ran. I ran out of those woods and down the gully and onto the beach. And I did not stop until I was standing in the shallows with the dead sea around my knees, the hatchet in one hand and the knife in the other, screaming at the tree line, daring it to come down into the light. And at the top of the gully, where the path came out of the trees, it came down into the light, and for the first time I saw it whole. I have tried many times to describe it, and I always fail, because it did not hold to one shape. It walked upright mostly, but it was wrong in every joint. Too long in the arm and the shin, the knees turning the wrong way like a thing that had learned to stand by watching men do it. Its skin was the gray of the island rock, and it hung loose, as if there were less inside it than there should have been, and it was patched all over with things that did not belong to it, with scraps of oilskin and a single leather boot strapped to one foot, and across the wide, flat horror of its face was what I can only call a mask of human skin, dried and stretched and tied behind the head, a face it had taken from one of the men in the woods, and now wore over its own. Behind that mask, its eyes were small and black, and they were full of an intelligence that was worse than any animal hunger. It knew exactly what it was doing. It had taken my boat apart with its hands because it wanted me to stay. It had let me find the bodies because it wanted me to understand. It had been patient with me, the way a man is patient with a meal he is in no hurry to eat. And now it came down the gully onto the beach in the last red light of the day, unhurried, and it tilted its masked head, and through the dead dry lips of the stolen face, it made a sound that climbed and broke and turned at the top into something almost exactly like a laugh. I would like to say I was brave. I was not. I was a man with nothing left in the world that wanted him back, and that, in the end, is the only thing that saved me. Because a man who is not clinging to his life is not trying to run, and you cannot run from a thing like that. It is faster than you, and it knows the ground. The only thing you can do is meet it. It came at me across the shingle faster than anything that size should move, its long arms reaching, and I did not flinch back. I stepped into it. I brought the hatchet down with everything I had, the whole weight of my body behind it, and I buried it in the meat where its neck met its shoulder, and the shock of the impact went up my arm and rattled my teeth, and the thing screamed. A real scream this time, high and furious, and gray blood that smelled of rot and salt sheeted out over my hands and arms. It hit me. I have been hit by things before. I have never been hit like that. One of those long arms caught me across the chest and lifted me off my feet and threw me 10 feet down the beach, and I felt ribs go, felt them crack and shift, and the breath left me entirely. And I lay in the cold shingle with the red sky spinning overhead and the wet, dragging sound of it coming for me. I rolled. I do not know how I rolled. The hand came down where my head had been, and the long black claws went into the shingle to the knuckle, and I drove the knife up into the wrist and through, pinning that terrible hand to the stones, and I twisted the blade and felt tendons part like wet rope. It reared back and tore its own hand free of the knife and of the beach, and 3 of its fingers stayed behind, twitching in the shingle, and the gray blood came out of the stumps and ropes. The hatchet was still in its shoulder. I went for the hatchet. I got both hands on the haft, and I wrenched it loose, and the thing's stolen face was right there above me. The dried human skin stretched over that wrong wide skull, and I swung the hatchet sideways into it, into the mask, and the blade went through the dead skin and into the living bone beneath. And the mask split and half of it peeled away, and underneath was a face I will see every night for the rest of my life. We went down together onto the stones. It was on top of me, and it was stronger, and it was dying, and it did not care that it was dying. It only wanted to take me with it, and its ruined hand was at my throat, and its good hand was tearing at my belly, the claws going in, hooking, and I felt them find something inside me and pull, and the pain was a white nothing, a roar that took the whole world. And in that white nothing, I got my thumb into one of its small black eyes. I pushed. I pushed with all the strength I had left, with the strength of every year I had spent learning to need no one and nothing, with the strength of a man who had already decided that if he was going to die on a piece of rock in a dead sea, then he was going to take this thing into the dark with him. My thumb went into the knuckle, and the eye burst, and something hot ran down my wrist, and the thing convulsed, its whole wrong body arching, and its grip loosened just enough. I got the hatchet up. I do not remember swinging it. I remember the sound, which was not one sound but many. The dull butcher's sound of the blade going into the side of its skull, again and again and again, and the screaming that climbed and broke, and finally, after the 7th blow, or the 8th, or the 20th, stopped. I remember that I did not stop when it stopped. I remember that I kept swinging long after there was anything left to swing at. Long after the gray blood and the black blood and my own red blood had run together across the shingle and into the dead flat sea, until my arms would not lift the hatchet any more, and I simply fell sideways into the wreckage of it and lay there with my cheek against the cooling stones. A fishing boat found me 2 days later. The younger man who had rented me the dinghy grew worried when I did not return it, and he came looking along the near coast, and he saw my fire, because I had crawled back up to the high meadow and built a fire, and fed it with everything I had, and lay beside it bleeding and waiting to die or be found. I was in the hospital on the mainland for 5 weeks. The claws had opened my belly and taken part of me that I will not get back, and 3 of my ribs had gone, and there was an infection in the wounds that the doctors could not name, that responded to no antibiotic they tried, that finally and inexplicably simply went away on the 19th day. They asked me what had attacked me. I told them a wild animal. There is no wild animal on these coasts that could have done what was done to me, and they knew it. And they wrote down wild animal anyway, because the alternative was a thing none of us wanted to say out loud. The old man from the guest house came to see me once, near the end. He did not say he had told me so. He sat by the bed and held my hand in his broad maimed one for a while, and then he asked me, very quietly, in his careful broken English, whether I had killed it, and I said yes. And he looked at me for a long moment, and he shook his head slowly, and he said,
"You killed the one that wore the faces. Good. But who do you think gave it the faces to wear?"
I did not understand him then. I've had a long time to think about it since. Because here is the thing I have told no one. The reason I will never go near the water on that coast again. When the fishing boat took me off the island, when they wrapped me in blankets and motored me back across that flat, dead sea, I looked back at the green crown of trees one last time. It was not the thing I killed. The thing I killed was on the beach in pieces. This was something else. It stood very still, the way the trees stood still. And even from that distance and through my fever, I could see that it was tall and that it was patient and that it had all the time in the world. It lifted one long arm and it waved.